This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Zack Gorchow.
And I'm Alethia Kasben. Michigan has its first declared candidate for the open U.S. Senate seat in 2026. State Senator Mallory McMorrow, a Democrat from Royal Oak, announced this week she is running to succeed Senator Gary Peters. Zack, who is Mallory McMorrow?
Good question. Mallory McMorrow burst onto the state's political scene in 2018 when, as a first-time candidate and relatively new resident of the state, she was one of many people motivated to run for office after President Trump won in 2016. She ran against a Republican incumbent in an area of Oakland County, places like Rochester Hills, my old hometown of Troy, and Royal Oak, that never seemed likely to elect a Democrat. But she won, knocked out the Republican incumbent. She became known as a talented communicator at a time when Democrats were in the minority in the Senate. And then she put that ability on display, didn't she?
She did. So some of our listeners may be one of the millions who saw McMorrow's speech on the Senate floor in 2022, where she went viral after responding forcefully to a Republican colleague who called McMorrow a groomer of children in a fundraising email. McMorrow was obviously furious that her colleague had used such comments against her and went off during that speech, hitting a main theme of hate won't win. Which is also the title of her book that came out last month. She is very active on social media, especially since the November election. She now often will take questions on Instagram weekly or more from those who are generally anxious about the current administration and are seeking advice, on what they can do.
And while in the Senate, she has chaired the Economic and Community Development Committee and becomes something of a foil to the Whitmer administration when it comes to how to attract and retain businesses. McMorrow's not as keen on using state aid as cash incentives as the governor is. But it's always felt like McMorrow had aspirations beyond the state capitol. She had another semi-viral moment at last year's Democratic National Convention where she held up a giant version of the Conservative Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Like you said, she wrote a book, and that's not your typical move for someone intending to run for one last term in the Michigan Senate.
Totally. And what I think is really interesting about the book is McMorrow did write she almost didn't even run for re-election in 2022 before her viral speech. Like you said, she was in the minority Democratic caucus. She was in a tough district. So, her bills weren't getting hearings. She felt like she wasn't doing anything. And then she made that speech. It propelled her to national status among Democrats. And now she's announced her run for U.S. Senate.
We need new leaders because the same people in D.C. who got us into this mess are not going to be the ones to get us out of it. I'm Mallory McMorrow, and yes, I'm running for U.S. Senate because we don't have a minute to wait. Are you with me?
McMorrow brings some strengths to this race. She can drive a message. You mentioned her Instagram chats. Those are really interesting. You don't see a lot of legislators doing that. She's comfortable in an interview. I think she's done 1 million this week. And that's going to help in addressing one of her weaknesses, which is she is not well known outside of Oakland County. She's worked in creative media, which enables her to message well on social media. And she's shown she's interested and capable of going into traditionally Republican areas like Rochester Hills, and in many cases succeeding at persuading voters not predisposed to vote for a Democrat to support her. That 2018 campaign was a barn burner. Republicans threw everything at her that year, and she still won.
Like you said, McMorrow is little known outside of Oakland County, which is probably her main weakness. But also, as we've discussed, she won a tough Senate race in 2018 as a first-time candidate who was completely unknown at that time. So, and I'd also say her brand is more progressive than not, and past Democratic U.S. Senate candidates have taken a more moderate lane. So that'll be interesting to see, if she might be a different kind of candidate than what we've seen in the past and if that can be successful for her. She is also likely to face multiple other candidates in the primary, and some will have stronger name ID.
Yeah, you make a great point on McMorrow being more to the left. I mean, think about Alyssa Slotkin with the ads showing her working for George W. Bush and Barack Obama and talking about working with President Trump. It is very hard to see Mallory McMorrow doing that. And when it comes to the primary, there definitely are a lot of possibilities out there. Attorney General Dana Nessel hasn't ruled herself out and has the strongest name recognition of any of the potential candidates. Then there's Congresswoman Haley Stevens, who lives just up Woodward Avenue from McMorrow in Birmingham. She's signaled interest, and she made a point of announcing 2 weeks in advance that she raised $1 million in the first 3 months of this year and is looking at how she can best serve the state. That certainly seems like she's teasing a run. Then you have Dr. Abdullah El-Sayed, who unsuccessfully ran for governor in 2018, but he recently resigned from his job in the Wayne County Health Department as he gets closer to entering the Senate race. And then there's some indications that perhaps State Representative Joe Tate is looking at the contest too. There's also Congresswoman Kristen McDonald-Rivet from Bay City. She's kept her name in the mix. McMorrow getting in first, however, gives her a chance to start building a campaign before these others, however.
So the Democrats have their first sign of life here, but Republicans are making moves too, although behind the scenes. Still no announcement from anyone despite lots of rumored interest. What is going on there, Zach?
You know, it is really interesting to see that weeks and weeks ago, Mike Rogers, who narrowly lost the 2024 Senate race to Alyssa Slotkin, virtually announced he was running, but not actually announce. Then you have Tudor Dixon, the 2022 Republican nominee for governor, flat out saying, I am planning to run for either governor or U.S. Senate. I'm just not sure what yet, and hasn't picked a lane. You have Congressman Bill Huizenga from Zeeland on the west side of the state. He hasn't taken his name out of the mix. Then there's State Senator John Lindsay, who's from Coldwater, former Green Beret. He's also, interested and ambitious, hasn't said for sure yet. And there could be others we just don't know about. And I have to think what potential candidates are leery of jumping into the race without some assurance that Trump will either endorse them or will stay out of the contest. Trump is batting 1,000 in statewide Republican primaries, 100%. His endorsees for governor and U.S. Senate won the GOP nomination in 2018, 2022, and 2024 in Michigan. He is 4-4-4.
Yes, well, his candidates may win the primary, but they are not winning general elections in any of those years.
Correct.
So Republicans have remained in this tricky spot with President Trump's endorsement. It's necessary for a primary, but maybe a liability for the general. Right now, Republicans are still riding high after a huge victory in November, but they might be forgetting they did not perform all too well in 2018, 2 years after the president's first victory. Special elections nationwide are showing Democrats overperforming and Republicans underperforming compared to November. So there's just a lot of unknowns on how 2026 is going to shake out for Republicans.
The other X factor I would say going into 2026 is the governor's race. Michigan voters have shown they're likely to make their own decision on the governorship independent of what's going on in the White House. It's not to say that perhaps there wouldn't be a reaction to Trump there. But if perhaps Republicans with their nominee for governor are successful at saying it's time for change from Governor Whitmer, that could throw a wrench in things. But certainly when you look at the Wisconsin Supreme Court race this week, and like you said, all the special elections so far this year, there are a lot of indications that this could set up just like 2018 did with a good year for Democrats.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Zack Stanton, deputy editor of Politico's Playbook and a Macomb County native, who will talk with us about this race and much more. Stick around.
Welcome back. I'm Zach Gorchow. Joining us now is Zack Stanton, deputy editor of Politico's Playbook. He is a Macomb County native who writes some of the great must-read deep dive coverage in politics, especially when it involves Michigan. In fact, the only fault I know of is that he spells Zach with a K. Zach, welcome to MichMash, and I'm sure you're like me. It's always fun, but a little disorienting to talk with another Zach.
It is. It's a Zach Palooza, but I appreciate you having me.
Well, we're glad you're here. So, Zach, where does Michigan's open U.S. Senate seat rank in importance when looking at the national map for the U.S. Senate in 2026? This was such a surprise that Gary Peters decided not to seek re-election. Republicans, of course, have a 53-47 effective majority, and Democrats are having to play some defense in this state.
Absolutely. And Democrats are worried about the seat only because Donald Trump has carried, of course, the state 2 of the last 3 presidential elections. And depending on how the gubernatorial race, which is on the ballot at the same time, plays out, you could have a stronger than anticipated Republican turnout in the state. It's really interesting, from a Washington perspective, to see how the Democratic race is shaping up at this point in time. Democrats see this as a must-win seat, a must-hold. Gary Peters was someone who was able to do that time and again. And the question is, who else can maintain that sort of statewide appeal? When we have people like Mallory McMorrow, who jumped in, of course, this week, jumping into the race, she really represents to me this shift that what we've seen in the Democratic Party's makeup. There's a sort of demographic component to her appeal. I grew up in Macomb County, as you noted, at a time when Macomb was a real Democratic powerhouse in a way. I was born in 1985. Throughout the 90s, it was a place Democrats came to time and again, and that had Democratic officials up and down the ballot. And at that time, Oakland County was really a Republican stronghold. And today, those positions have totally reversed. And that story is partly the story of people like Mallory McMorrow, who is from Royal Oak, which was a battleground in the 90s, but was also home to places like Birmingham, which was part of her district when she was first elected to the state Senate. That was really Romney Republican territory. But the Republican Party has sort of shifted away from that in the Trump era. And partly that's because of Trump, and partly that's because education has become a huge partisan predictor now. And it's about the way the Democratic Party has become more affluent. I remember a couple of years ago when I was doing a deep dive into Oakland County, someone I talked to pointed out to me that Troy, Michigan is now more vote rich for Democrats statewide than Flint is. And just facts like that are just wild when you consider what the state looked like, in the 90s. So there's this demographic component to it at all. But I also don't want to sell someone like Mallory McMorrow short. She's an enormously talented politician. And I think a lot of people in Washington, when they see her, they see sort of a gifted natural athlete, that there's something there that isn't fully learned. It's there, it's it. And she seems to have that. And the question now, I think, to a lot of people is what could complicate her path, because she seems like far and away the strongest candidate in the field thus far, though there are people like Haley Stevens, who potentially is running, Abdul Al-Sayed potentially is running, and then on the Republican side, folks like Tudor Dixon, who are giving it a look as well.
So you've really set up both of the questions that I wanted to ask you next here. So first, let's start with Senator McMorrow and her jumping into the race this week. With the potential field, including U.S. Rep. Haley Stevens, they're both Oakland County lawmakers. Do you think this leaves an opening for someone else?
Potentially. The question is, how does a three-way Democratic primary play out? And we have some vaguely similar things to draw from when, we had the 2018 Democratic primary with Gretchen Whitmer and Abdul Al-Sayed and Sri Thanadar. That was a little bit different because, then State Senator Whitmer was the only one who was an established politician. But you see Mallory McMorrow and Haley Stevens both as young sort of rising stars in the party who both come from the similar area in Oakland County, potentially represent a similar demographic and have similar appeal. But I think one thing that isn't to be underestimated in this era of virality is the extent to which Mallory McMorrow has been able to sort of speak to something deep about what Democrats believe on some basic level. And that, I think, to a lot of Democrats, particularly in the Trump era, when they feel kind of adrift, appeals to them. And we've already seen Senator McMorrow, State Senator McMorrow, in her announcement video, sort of take what could be read as a shot at someone like Haley Stevens, that the same people in Washington who help get us into this mess aren't going to be the ones to get us out of this mess, which is really billing herself as this change candidate and someone who's going to be a change agent and someone who isn't part of Congress already. And so we're beginning to see what the potential fissure lines are in that race.
Do you have a sense of, who national Democrats want to see emerge as the Democratic nominee? Do you think McMorrow is the early sort of favorite here? And do you think that we could have, a competitive primary for a U.S. Senate race, which would be really unusual?
I think it's certainly possible that there could be a competitive primary. I think Mallory McMorrow was smart to jump in when she did, which can potentially freeze the field. If she has a good early fundraising show, which I think she probably will, that will do a lot to advance her cause. There are a lot of people that are familiar with Haley Stevens here in Washington and would be eager to see her jump in the race. But it remains to be seen exactly who the favorite is, other than to say both of them are seen as strong candidates and people who can win in suburban areas that have been really important to Democrats and which will stand to be pretty important in this midterm election coming up here.
It's interesting how different in many ways Haley Stevens and Mallory McMorrow are. First, I would recommend to everybody they go back and read Zack's 2022 post-Democratic primary piece on how Haley Stevens beat Andy Levin. It is a great, great read, and I think gives some decent insight into Stevens. But, McMorrow is all over social media. She is doing these Instagram chats. She's kind of everywhere, especially for a member of the Michigan legislature. Stevens is a little bit more behind the scenes. You don't see her doing that kind of stuff. McMorrow does all kinds of interviews all the time. Haley Stevens is really reticent to do interviews. She once walked away from one of our reporters at an event and tried to talk to her. So it's a really different style, even if ideologically they're probably pretty close. So if it does end up being the two of them going up against each other, I'd be really interested to see how that plays out. So let's talk about the Republicans. Mike Rogers clearly wants to run it back. He all but announced, but didn't, about a month ago. Are there any signals out of the National Republican Senatorial Committee about whether they'd like to see him give it another try after coming up just short in 24 to Slotkin? Or are they thinking maybe it's time for someone new?
I think for the Republicans, the question is who that someone new would be. I think that Mike Rogers is sort of a known quantity, and they feel like he came pretty close to winning that Senate race, at least from their perspective, in 2024. But the difficulty that surely weighs on them is that 2026 isn't going to be 2024. You're not going to have Donald Trump on the ballot. And so a lot of the sort of low propensity voters that came out and supported Trump and then, kind of checked the rest of the ballot and there was some drop off, but they still supported Republicans down the ballot. That's not what the electorate's going to look like. And so you can approach that in a couple ways. One is to say, who is going to be able to appeal to the sort of suburban, more affluent electorate in 2026, and someone like Mike Rogers could be appealing there. The question is, who else would be? And so you have a very different approach. If someone like Tudor Dixon is in fact the candidate, she is a known quantity in a very different way. There is not a lot of optimism on Republican circles about what her candidacy would represent in terms of the competitiveness of the seat, but they also see, the X factor there is, could she have some sort of Trump-like appeal where she brings out low propensity voters who are conservative? That's entirely possible. She is someone who also deals in virality in sort of the Republican circles online and conservative circles, MAGA circles online. And it's entirely possible that, she could represent a different approach to what a Republican coalition might look like. But I tend to think that Republicans in the establishment here, at least, are much more in favor of Mike Rogers than Tudor Dixon.
Are you surprised no Republicans have announced yet? And why do you think that might be the case?
I am a little surprised. I think that might be the case because the giant sort of X factor in all of this and all of the 2026 calculations is what exactly John James wants to do. He is sort of freezing the field by not quite having announced what exactly he's running for, though all signs seem to suggest that, if he's running for anything statewide, it would be governor. But he would also represent a big recruiting coup for Senate Republicans if they were able to get him to run for Senate. So that is a little surprising. I think that he's sort of freezed the field a bit. But I know that there are other Republicans that are taking a look here. And that's not to say that there aren't other Republicans that have jumped into things like the gubernatorial race, of course, where we have folks like Eric Nesbitt. But I am surprised that there hasn't been a more of an effort to immediately jump in and try and pick up early momentum in this race for an open Senate seat, which comes along so rarely in Michigan.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, too. And I think the other factor here, too, is there are so many candidates who've run statewide before with President Trump's endorsement. So I think there has to be some behind the scenes calculations of like, if I jump in, are you going to jump in too? And then all of a sudden we're going to be battling for this endorsement we maybe, both had before. Looking more broadly at 2026, we're seeing signs in special elections so far, and with the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, with Democrats, doing well. Could this point to a similar situation like we saw in the 2018 midterms where, Democrats flipped control of the U.S. House, 7 governorships nationally? That year in Michigan, Democrats won all 3 Michigan statewide offices and flipped 2 U.S. House seats. Are we looking at that again?
That's certainly how Democrats are feeling. This past Tuesday evening seemed to be the first moment, at least in my eyes, the first moment since the November election where I was seeing a lot of Democrats optimistic about the direction of things politically. It was a good night for Democrats. They lost both Florida special elections for both House seats that were up for grabs, but they lost them well. The margins were very encouraging because these were 2 deep red seats. There was the former seat belonging to Congressman Matt Gaetz in the westernmost edge of the Panhandle along the Alabama border, which is a really conservative area. And Republicans carried it by roughly the same margin that they won in the 6th district, which is this largely suburban seat centered around Daytona Beach and St. Augustine, which is where now National Security Advisor Mike Waltz represented before he stepped down to become NSA. And those results suggest a Democratic wave that may not be enough to breach some of these Republican strongholds, but that could be enough to flip seats that are, say, Republicans plus 10 or even Republicans plus 15. And even though they lost in Florida, I think Democrats would gladly take those Florida losses if they win Wisconsin, which they did. And national Democrats have been upfront about the fact that they harbor a hope that the liberal-controlled state Supreme Court in Wisconsin could throw out the district maps in that state, and that would potentially net Democrats more House seats than just picking up one of these GOP-held Florida seats. So it was a good night for Democrats in that sense, and it was also a good night for them in the sense of how it played into this narrative about what 2026 is going to look like, in the sense that it was a bad night for Elon Musk. Musk staked a lot on Wisconsin. He poured a lot of money into it, and millions, I think $27 million of his own money, which is just an unfathomably large amount to me, but is a rounding error for him. And it's consequential in as much as that money feeds into this narrative Democrats have eagerly promoted, which is that the Republican Party in the age of Trump has become beholden to billionaires and major donors like Elon Musk. But just as importantly, it's a sign of how Democrats are sort of nationalizing these elections. When you have a national environment that is favorable to you, you want to nationalize these races and make them about national themes. When it isn't favorable to you, you want to localize the campaign. So, for instance, you can talk about, yes, I am a member of this Republican Party, but I brought in this money to expand M59 and bring new investment to Macomb County, and you make that sort of argument, focusing on local issues. And what Elon Musk did was sort of make the race about him, especially in the closing days. And Democrats are very eager to make all the races they can about Elon Musk or about Donald Trump in 2026. And so that's going to be a real uphill battle for a lot of Republicans, is how to make these races not about these national themes, especially when folks like Musk and Trump occupy so much attention and bring so much focus whenever they wade into local or state races.
Do you think there is anything Republicans can do to sort of slow this tide leading up to a potential, good Democratic year? And I also want to say that both Zacks here have alluded to, the gubernatorial race in Michigan in 2026 potentially, I think, helping Republicans a little bit here, right? Because we are also looking at, voters wanting to potentially see a change, in our state leadership going from a Democrat to potentially a Republican.
I think that that's exactly right. The change factor works out a bit for Republicans in Michigan in a way that it doesn't nationally. So that would be, I think, the thing that gives Republicans some hope about what 2026 looks like in a Michigan perspective. And it's very difficult to hold on to a gubernatorial seat in Michigan after 2 or 3 terms of one party controlling the seat. We see this historically. We look at Jim Blanchard, flipping to John Engler, and we look at Engler flipping to Granholm after he was term limited, Granholm flipping to Snyder flipping to Whitmer. It's difficult for any party in control to maintain that power for very long because the desire for change from voters just inevitably comes up regardless of who's in control. And so that would be what I would say is buoying Republicans in the state of Michigan. That's not to say that they'll have like the year of their dreams, but it could be a better year than a lot of Democrats are expecting that it will be for Republicans.
So let's talk about Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Really interesting change of tack for her this year. She has really, maybe even moved a little bit right of center in some ways. Her State of the State speech really caught a lot of attention for talking about things like we have to do more for young boys in school and make sure they're not falling behind. She talked about things like improving the state's licensing and permitting processes. She talked about the need to cut spending on other programs to fund roads. Really, unexpected stuff. And most of all, from a national standpoint, she has really almost been aggressively unaggressive toward President Trump and frustrated some Democrats on that. What do you make of how Whitmer is handling things since Trump took office on January 20th?
So I think it speaks to this extremely smart, politically savvy side to Gretchen Whitmer that Washington gets to some degree, but I don't think really fully appreciates. It reminds me a bit of early on in 2020, someone noted that Joe Biden at that time had always been very good in his career about positioning himself at sort of the ideological center of the Democratic Party, wherever it was at a certain point in time. And I think that that's true of Whitmer too. She really leaned into the sort of resistance vibe early on in the first Trump administration, which was very much where the party was at. And now in the second Trump administration, has a very different feel to it. She is not someone who is out there talking about him being a threat to democracy, even if she privately believes that. She's not taking the sort of stances of a Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker or a Colorado Governor Jared Polis on something like that. And I think to her advantage, moderates, whether in the Democratic Party or not, moderates don't see her as a fire-breathing liberal, but liberals, generally speaking, don't really see her as a moderate squish either. She's sort of this platonic ideal of a Democrat in the eyes of a lot of people in Washington. And that has a lot of Washington sort of salivating at the prospect of her as a potential candidate down the road here nationally if she wants to run. It's easy to see what the appeal is. You look at someone who has handily won twice statewide in a place that Trump carried in 2024 and 2016. And to a lot of people, that suggests that she knows how to win in places where Democrats have struggled since the end of the Obama era. And I think, especially after Trump's victory this past November, which I think hit a lot of Democrats as more of a blow than his win in 2016, that is something that seems like much more of a must-have quality heading into the 2028 cycle. And I know it's very early and no one wants to talk about 2028 yet, but that's very much the way Washington thinks of things, is just in a very Washington-centric view. And so the presidential conversation is something that is sort of percolating in D.C. And her appeal is similar in some respects to that of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro in the eyes of a lot of people here in Washington, which is that she is someone who has proven an ability to win in states that Democrats have had trouble winning in recent elections.
Well, count me as one of the annoying people who is going to ask about 2028. I don't know how I became this person. But the governor was scheduled to give a speech in D.C. this week, right? Then she canceled it because of some weather here in Michigan that she's dealing with. As we just said, she's acting differently with President Trump than she did during his first term. Are these actions, you're calling her political savvy, right? Are these actions the actions of someone who is looking at a presidential run in a few years?
That is the question that I've been trying to get to the bottom of. I think everyone has, and it's difficult because I don't want to crack open Governor Whitmer's head and like try and examine what she's thinking, but I really do want to do that. I think that she's clearly someone who has spent an enormous amount of her life at this point in time around politics, and she's a very savvy political creature. And it's difficult to see some of her moves upping her national profile as not political. Like, what is the rationale behind writing this book, True Gretch, and writing a young adult version of it, which enabled her to go on sort of a second round of the media and publicity tour. She is a governor in a swing state who is charismatic and relatable, but sort of in a non-threatening way. Her charisma isn't. Her charisma is very folksy in a way that it doesn't seem like it's the cool of the charisma of a Barack Obama type. And part of the whole True Gretch push to me was really emphasizing that her political superpower is this sense of authenticity, that she's relatable, that she's human. And in her book, it's filled with self-deprecating stories. You hear about her front teeth being false, that she knocked them out when she was a kid, or that she has 2 tattoos, including one that's a shark. And, she talks about her parents' divorce and her own divorce and her love of gallows humor. And the book is interesting to read in that it's not sort of this cohesive narrative of like, up from the bootstraps, I was born in a log cabin type thing that you often see from politicians. But what it lacks in that, it really makes up for in sort of a multifaceted portrait of a real human being. So that human part is a big part of her appeal. As for what she is thinking, it's hard to know. I mean, she could want to run in 2028. At the very least, she doesn't lose anything from people thinking that she wants to. She has a lot to gain from not being seen entirely as a lame duck in that sense. And being part of the conversation enables her to maintain power and maintain some political sway in a way that she perhaps wouldn't if she was just seen as a term-limited governor who's not interested or doesn't have really a path to anything higher.
Well, Zack, thanks so much for joining us on MichMash this week. We really appreciate your insights, and keep up the great work. I can't wait for your next deep dive. I always get really excited when I see a by Zack Stanton byline.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.